My dad always told me this story growing up as one of those listen to your gut lessons, although I didn't know the grisly details until I was older. This happened in Indiana in the mid-70s when my dad was middle school or early high school aged. His house was only about 6 or 7 blocks from his school, so he would walk home whenever the weather was nice. One day during his walk home, he noticed a guy in a van driving by him very slowly. It was a bit strange, but he didn't think anything of it. But it kept happening, again and again. Eventually, the driver of the van started yelling things at him, usually asking him to buy drugs. This was when my dad recognized the guy as Roger. Roger was about 9 years older than him, but my dad was friends with one of his relatives, so he knew who he was. The cycle of Roger following my dad for blocks, asking him to buy drugs, continued for a long time. My dad knew there was something deeply off about Roger. He was so afraid when Roger yelled at him that he wouldn't look up or respond at all. He just stared at the ground and hurried home. These walks must have felt like they took forever. Eventually, after my dad had a huge growth spurt one summer, Roger stopped following him. Maybe it was because he looked more physically intimidating, or maybe Roger just decided to move on. But either way, my dad was relieved that the interaction stopped. Fast forward to Valentine's Day, 1977. In a small remote town nearby, a woman was home with her son and 3 stepsons. Roger and 3 other men broke into her home with shotguns and forced her and the boys to lay face down on the floor. Roger and his gang threatened and taunted them for hours before finally shooting them one by one. One of the shots partially blew off the wig that the mother was wearing, so Roger thought he had blown off her skull. Assuming she was dead, he stopped shooting, and they left. She survived, later describing the horrible noises she heard as she lied there, waiting for the men to disappear, slowly realizing that she was hearing the sound of the blood drain from her children. She said it almost sounded like a waterfall. Roger and the other men walked away with a grand total of $40, but it was clear that it was never about the robbery. It was about the thrill of taking human lives. The mother was eventually able to identify Roger and 3 other men in a lineup. Indiana didn't have a death penalty at the time, so each man was sentenced to multiple life sentences. Roger recently died in prison. I know it's unlikely that my dad would have been murdered by Roger, but the fact that he was so close, so often, to someone who was capable of something like that is unsettling. About 2 years ago, I was managing a pizza place in a shitty little town. Since I was the new manager, I got stuck with night shifts for my first year there. This whole thing started with the phone calls. They were always the same. A man would call about an hour before close and politely ask for Kelly. I would always tell him that Kelly wasn't working that night and apologize before hanging up. Sometimes he would make a second phone call half an hour later, asking the same thing. I told the general manager, who said he would mention it to Kelly to see if they could figure out who was calling. One night, after again telling the mysterious caller that Kelly wasn't working, he started screaming at me. "Don't fucking lie to me, Kelly. I know that's you. We aren't playing this game anymore." Slightly panicked, I explained that I wasn't Kelly, and she's been working at our other location for months, and that he must have the wrong person. He just hung up, and the phone call stopped after that. About a week later, I made a temporary move to the day shift so I could get more training, and Kelly returned to my location to take over the night shift. Confused, I asked if she was nervous working the night shift with all those phone calls we'd been getting. She just started laughing. She explained that the phone calls had been from her boyfriend, and he was just confused about what store she was working in and kept calling the wrong one. It seemed like a likely enough explanation, and I didn't want to push it anymore, so I brushed it off and enjoyed my glorious week of working the day shift. On my first night back, I finished up closing and was walking to my car when I noticed an SUV parked in the connecting grocery store parking lot. It had its lights on and was facing the pizza shop. I was a little unnerved, but it wasn't exactly uncommon for cars to be there at night. Lots of drug deals, people living in their cars, things like that. I mentioned it to my general manager the next day, who told me to call the police if I ever saw it again. Sure enough, that night, it was there again. Looking back, I should have called the cops like my GM told me to, but I tend to be too trusting. It was there again the next night, and I promised myself that if I saw it even one more time after that, I'd call, but that was the last time I did. About a week later, our delivery driver had done a heavy mop in the store and decided to leave the back door open to help the floor dry. He was also a huge dick, so he ended up leaving for the night with the door still open without telling me. A little while later, I heard it slam shut. To fight off my paranoia, I told myself the wind must have blown it shut, and continued the night without investigating. It locks when it closes, so I didn't really have any reason to go back there. The next day when I came in, my boss was pissed. He started going off on me for smoking in the bathroom and took me to the back office to throw 2 burnt-out camel butts on the desk. I explained that they must have rolled under something and got pulled out by the broom during cleaning the previous night. The only person in the store who smokes camels anyway is Kelly. He accepted my excuse, but still wasn't happy, and told me to make sure the floors were getting swept properly from now on. The next day was Valentine's Day, and I had the day off. I got a call around 11 p.m. from the closing manager who was working that night, clearly very shaken. They had the back door open to dry the floors again, and Kelly's boyfriend walked in with his hands behind his back and demanded to know where she was. The manager panicked and told him he needed to show his hands before he would answer anything. The guy turned around and took off running. The manager ran outside after him to see him taking off in an SUV, likely the one that I'd seen parked in the lot so many times before. They called the cops, who searched the area but didn't find anything. The next day, the GM called Kelly to ask her about what that possibly could have been about. According to her, he had been there to bring her flowers, but again got confused about which store she was working at. The manager called bullshit. There was no way they wouldn't have noticed flowers behind his back. The GM didn't have much choice but to take her word for it, but told her to inform her boyfriend that personal visits weren't allowed. About a week or so later, Kelly quit. The GM told me she had left her boyfriend. I guess what happened was that she would tell him she was working at my location of the shop whenever she was going to cheat on him because it was farther away from her house. The only reason she got away with it for so long was he kept mistaking me for her from afar since we looked so similar. To this day, I still believe he came in the back door that night I was working and hid in the bathroom. Just sitting there, smoking, trying to get up the courage to do whatever he was planning on doing to Kelly. I wonder what would have happened if my other coworker hadn't been there when he showed up on Valentine's Day. What would have happened if I had been working and had my back turned? Back in December of 2004, it still doesn't seem real that it's been over 10 years, I was living in Portland, Oregon, attending college. I was sitting at home one night writing my last research paper for the term with my Yahoo instant messaging up, chatting with a few friends. Suddenly, a message from someone who wasn't on my list popped up. It said, "Have you ever thought about suicide?" Okay, weird, but hey, it's almost midnight on a Sunday, and I've been asked stranger things online. I decided to message a stranger back for kicks, telling them, sure, who hasn't at some point, why? Asking that question really opened up Pandora's box. He bombarded me with questions about how I wanted to die and why I wanted to die, whether I wanted to die with others. The questions were getting creepier as the conversation continued, but I decided to play along, assuming the guy was just screwing with me. I asked for his name, and he introduced himself as Jerry. I asked him to send me a picture of himself, and he sent me a link to a profile picture on Hot or Not. He asked if I thought he was good looking, and I said, yeah, sure, he's cute, whatever. He then asked to see a picture of me. I sent him a random old photo of a girl from my MySpace friends, and he said he thought I was a 10. Great, just what I wanted to hear from Jerry, the internet stranger who's obsessed with suicide. As the conversation continued, he told me he was sick of life and that women didn't seem to be attracted to him, so he wanted to end it all. I told him all the things you're supposed to say to people in that situation, that romantic relationships aren't important and that you're more important to the people in your life and you're worth more than that, blah blah blah. I'm not heartless, but I wasn't feeling super motivated to talk a stranger off a ledge at 1 a.m. when I was trying to do schoolwork. Jerry told me he met a lot of women online that wanted to kill themselves, and he was planning on a party for Valentine's Day, which was about a month and a half away at the time. He said the plan was for everyone to do it together at his house in Oregon. He then asked me if I was interested in joining. Absolutely sure at this point that he must be joking, I sarcastically told him I wanted to go, but didn't have a car to get down there for it. He told me there were a few women from my town that were coming down and that we could carpool together. He also went on to say he built extra beams in the house so that it could hold up 50 bodies at once, but that I shouldn't wear shoes because they'll weigh me down. At this point, I started to recognize how serious this guy actually was. There was no way this could be a joke. I started asking specifics, like what his address was, what his full name is, and who the women are that would be traveling down from Portland. He told me their names and that one of them was bringing her 5 children with her. It was then that I decided to call the police. While still chatting with Jerry, I called a friend of mine from Eastern Oregon who works as a 911 dispatcher. She happened to be working when I called her, and I told her the whole story. Right away, she advised me to hang up and call the Portland Police Department, just to at least pass the information to the police in Jerry's town. She made a record in their system about my call as well, just in case. I kept talking to Jerry while I called the Portland police. They ended up sending out 2 officers to my house, and when they arrived about an hour later, they basically just laughed at me when I told them what was going on. I printed out the chat log and gave them the guy's full name and address, which I had already verified was likely legitimate through some Google searching. They simply told me to stop talking to him and went about their business. I felt so stupid after hearing the officer's reaction. I called my friend back to tell her what the police did, and she said I should still keep an eye on things and continue saving our conversations. That's exactly what I did. For the next 2 hours, I continued trying to get details out of him. Eventually, it got to the point where I couldn't handle it anymore. He was asking me such detailed questions about how I wanted to die. Finally, I just told him I'd be in touch closer to Valentine's Day. For the most part after that, I laughed off the experience with my friends. Since the Portland PD never got back to me about anything, I assumed they ended up finding out it was just a strange prank. Not too long later, though, on February 10th, 2005, a friend of mine called me in a panic, telling me that a guy from Jerry's hometown had been arrested. He was trying to set up a mass suicide pact for Valentine's Day. I was floored. I ran into my office and logged onto a computer right away, and sure enough, it was all over the news. Gerald Crine arrested for plotting mass suicide Valentine's Day party. My 911 dispatcher friend called me when she heard the news and told me to call the Portland PD again to tell them I had reported this back in December. I made the call, and about an hour later, 2 FBI agents were coming to pick me up from my job to take me home and confiscate my computer for analysis. We sat in my living room and I was questioned for hours about my involvement and whether or not I was actually planning to commit suicide. I told them over and over again that I just continued talking to the guy as a joke, assuming it was some sort of prank, and that I only called the cops when he brought up the woman who was planning on bringing her children. I told them I gave all the information I had to the Portland police officers back in December, and that there was no way for me to know they never did anything with it. Which they didn't. They just sat on it, probably shredded the printouts I gave them, and never passed any information to the police in Jerry's town. The agents told me the story had gotten a lot bigger, and that Jerry had contacted hundreds of people about his plan. At least 30 agreed to come on Valentine's Day to commit suicide together. The police finally got involved when one woman's parents found some emails between her and Jerry and called the cops. That's how they heard about this. Not from my call nearly 2 months prior, but from these emails from less than a week before Valentine's Day. I was completely freaked out by the end of our conversation when the FBI agents dropped me back off at work. I told my boss everything that was going on, and she let me know that reporters had been calling non-stop since I left, wanting to talk to me. She told me she didn't give them my number, but had a feeling it was only a matter of time before they showed up at the office. I was a student worker on my college campus, so my name was all over the school website and directory. If the press got their hands on a police report, there was no saying how fast they'd be able to track me down. By the time I went back home with my mom to take a sanity break later that evening, the media had already tracked down our address. I was harassed and chased down for weeks until I finally gave in to give an interview to Good Morning America, hoping it would make things die down. It was still crazy for a while, though. Every news outlet tried to get more details out of me. Jerry is still sitting in the Salem State Hospital for his crimes of solicitation to commit murder. I had my 15 seconds of fame, and I hope I never have to deal with that shit again.